This is a CBS 2 News special in partnership with WVON Radio, the Business Leadership Council, and the Ida B. Wells Legacy Fund. Now, live from the Morningstar Auditorium atop the CBS 2 Broadcast Center, the final debate.
Welcome to the Morningstar Auditorium. City Hall stands right behind me, and that's where one of these candidates will make history as the first African-American woman to take over the office of mayor for Chicago. Good evening, I'm Erica Sargent. With just 6 days to go until Election Day, this packed auditorium wants to hear how Toni Preckwinkle and Lori Lightfoot will lead the city of Chicago. Wherever you are, we want you to watch the debate and join the conversation. Use the hashtag #FinalDebateOn2 to participate on our Facebook page and Twitter. Now, the format for tonight's debate consists of opening statements, questions from our panelists and me, questions from the candidates to each other, and closing remarks. Let's begin with opening statements. Ms. Preckwinkle, you won the coin toss, so we begin with you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us this evening. You know, I know we live in a beautiful city and it faces great challenges, and I look forward to addressing those challenges. And I know this is an historic moment as an African-American woman. You know, you can't be what you can't see. And I think it's great that our young people have an opportunity to see people in leadership positions fighting for them and for their futures. And I learned early on the importance of standing up for yourself and fighting for yourself and the things you believe in and the people that you love. There were 2 black families in my elementary school, and my younger brother and I spent a lot of time fighting our way home from school, at least until we were in the 4th grade and as big as the 6th graders. And I learned a number of things from that experience. 1, bullies like massacres and not fights, and when we could give them a fight, they pretty much left us alone. And secondly, that you're going to have to, in your life, stand up for the things you believe in and the people that you love. I think that's an important lesson to take into the mayor's office. It's important for our young people to understand that there'll be somebody in the mayor's office who's fighting for them and their future.
We turn now to you, Ms. Lightfoot. You have 1 minute for your opening statement.
We are 6 days away from one of the most historic elections in our time. The first time since 1986, when Harold Washington ran for the 2nd time, that we really have the opportunity to make real, dynamic, transformative change in our city. What I've heard from people every day on the campaign trail since February 26 is that they want change. They see it as a possibility. They want to break from the corrupt political machine that has held back the aspirations of so many people, whether it's a small business person, whether it's the person on the block. They want a government which is responsive to them, that has integrity, and that they have a leadership that they have confidence and can believe in. This is what's at stake in this election, and I look forward to continuing that conversation over these next 6 days. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lightfoot. Now let's move on to the questions. You will each have 1 minute to answer. You will have 30 seconds for follow-ups and rebuttals. First, I want to introduce you, though, to our panelists. Let's start with CBS 2 co-anchor and 2 investigator, Brad Edwards, WVON Radio's Kim Agowan, and CBS 2 political reporter, Derek Blakely. We are going to spend the first part of our time talking about important questions that have been raised because of the stunning decision to drop the charges against Jussie Smollett. Now, shortly after that decision, Mayor Rahm Emanuel held an impromptu news conference and condemned the state's attorney, Kim Foxx. He went as far as calling the prosecutor's decision to drop the 16 felony counts a whitewash. And this is a question for both of you. Now, Ms. Lightfoot, you won the coin toss to answer first, so I'm starting with you. As mayor, in the heat of that moment, while the city is reeling in that decision, would you go as far as publicly criticizing the state's attorney? And what would your message be to the city of Chicago?
Well, look, I think it's the decision to drop all these charges within 5 weeks of the charges being brought against Mr. Smollett raises a lot of questions. And I've consistently said since yesterday that I call upon First Assistant Joe McGatt to give fuller disclosure about that decision, because the concern is the optics. The optics look like if you're rich and famous, you got one kind of justice, and if you're everybody else, it's something entirely different. So I think to make sure that our criminal justice system has integrity, in fact, and not just in optics, that the state's attorney's office has to give a much more fulsome explanation as to what happened. Look, I think these are difficult decisions. I think that what happened, the lack of advance notice to the mayor and the superintendent, was really unfortunate. But always, as a leader, your tone has to be measured, and you have to make sure that you are leading in a way that is going to give people confidence in institutions of government, like the criminal justice system.
Thank you, Ms. Lightfoot. Ms. Preckwinkle, the same question to you. What would be your response to the city, the message, and also would you publicly criticize the state's attorney if you did not agree with her decision?
Well, I think the critical issue here is transparency and accountability. I'm not a lawyer and I'm not the state's attorney, but I think from the public's perception, the important issue is we need to know as much about what happened and why. So I think the state's attorney has to be really forthcoming about the reasons for the dismissal. And I think in this instance, the judge needs to unseal the record so that the public has an opportunity to see what really transpired. And I'm a big believer in judicial discretion, but in this instance, I think it's important to ask the judge to release those documents. This is a case in which there are a lot of questions, and those questions are unanswered. And only through a focus on transparency and accountability can I think the public have some confidence that justice was done. Okay,
the next question comes from Brad Edwards. Brad.
Thank you, Erica. Good evening.
Good
This
evening.
is also a question for both of you. The dropping of charges against Jussie Smollett created a crisis for the next mayor. The police department was given no heads up on the move. Then Mr. Smollett doubled down on his innocence. A slap in the face to the hard work of the CPD and to the generosity of the SA's office. On day one, you will need to repair the relationship that is untenable, sources say, between Police Superintendent Eddie Johnson and the state's attorney Kim Foxx and their respective departments. It's broken, and the whole country has now seen that. Ms. Preckwinkle first. Specifically, how do you plan to repair the damage done?
Well, the work that I've done as Cook County Board President is all about bringing people together, bringing stakeholders together to address serious challenges. And in the criminal justice arena, we brought the stakeholders together to address the challenge of injustice in our criminal justice system, and particularly what happened in bond court, namely that those who are too poor to pay their bond ended up spending weeks or months in jail simply because of their poverty. And bringing stakeholders together to try to address serious challenges is what I've done throughout my career, and it's particularly what I've done in the criminal justice arena. So I think you have to bring not just the state's attorney and the superintendent of police, but all of the actors in the criminal justice arena together to try to address this challenge. And I think it's not an insurmountable problem. I think when a little time has passed and tempers have cooled, you need to get people together to understand that they have the same interest, that is a just criminal justice system, and that we need to work together to ensure that that's the case.
Ms. Lightfoot, how do you repair the damage done and restore that bond between CPD and the state's attorney's office?
Well, I'm going to push back a little bit on the premise of your question. This isn't a crisis for the mayor. This is an incident that was clearly unfortunate. There's a symbiotic relationship between the law enforcement and the prosecutor's office. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. And we obviously have to make sure that we understand exactly what happened. Certainly it would have been better if the state's attorney's office had given advance notice to the police superintendent about the decision that they were going to make to drop these charges. That is the prosecutor's discretion. But obviously there should be respect from the prosecutor's office for the police department because of the nature of their relationship. So I think that's something that we certainly can work through, but I think where it's got to start is there's got to be more fulsome information from the state's attorney's office about the how, who, what, and when that led to the seemingly strange situation where they say the evidence was fine, that they believe that he's guilty, and yet they gave him essentially a pass.
Thank you, Ms. Lightfoot. Kim, the next question to both.
Thank you and good evening.
Good evening.
Again, this question is for both of you. The Smollett case has exposed a nasty fact, more than just optics, but a nasty fact about policing in Chicago. Now, when a famous person with connections, or a high-profile victim, or even if a crime happens in a certain neighborhood, there's no limit of police resources. Everything and everyone is assigned. But in the neighborhoods where you're not high-profile, there remains a 12% murder clearance rate. And a CBS 2 investigation points to a possible serial killer murdering women on the South Side who hasn't been caught and maybe not even acknowledged by the CPD. Ms. Lightfoot, how specifically will your police reform plan end this inequity once and for all?
Well, we've laid out a 16-page, single-space public safety plan last fall. And specifically with respect to the homicide clearance rate, we obviously have to do better. We look at other peer cities like Los Angeles or New York that are routinely at 60 and 70%, and the fact that if someone is killed, it's in the teens, and if you have the audacity to live after being shot, it's in the single digit. I've been very, very clear that this is unacceptable. It's got to start with a number of different things. First, our detectives have to get out of their offices, get into the community, and start building relationships with people on the ground in these neighborhoods before an incident happens. Going in after the fact, walking up on somebody's porch, and essentially fronting them in front of their neighbors is not helpful. The other thing we have to do is make sure that there's better communication and cooperation between beat officers and detectives. And we also need to make sure that the detectives are well trained in all of the latest technology to be able to help them do their job better, particularly when it comes to homicide. But fundamentally, there's got to be more accountability.
Ms. Preckwinkle, the same to you. How will you reform the police plan so it is more equitable?
Well, I think this is a real challenge around police-community relations. And, you know, the way crimes get solved is that officers get cooperation and collaboration from the community members and are able to solve them. It isn't in forensics labs, and it surely isn't in an hour, as you see on television. So I think it's really important that we invest further in community policing, not just our beat meetings, but also in engaging community members, members of our faith community, doing a lot of outreach in the neighborhoods in order to build a spirit of collaboration and cooperation with our police. It's also really important that our police officers be better trained in crisis intervention, in ways in which they can deal with challenges. It's important that they be well supervised, and we really have to hold them accountable. This figure of 15% closure rates for murders and less than 10% for shootings is a real challenge in our neighborhoods, because people on the street know that if their friend or family member or brother is murdered, it's really unlikely that someone's going to be held accountable.
Thank you, Ms. Preckwinkle. Moving on to the next question, it comes from Derek Blakely.
Thank you, Erica. And our next question is for Ms. Lightfoot. We spent a lot of time already discussing what some believe was a mistake in the state's attorney's office, and now we want to ask a question about police mistakes. CBS 2 investigators have been uncovering several wrong raids by police, raids in which police have bad information and break down doors, resulting in terrifying incidents in which innocent people are just scared to death. Ms. Lightfoot, you were once part of the Police Department of Professional Standards, and also you led the Police Accountability Task Force. What will be your first action to make sure that another family is not victimized in this way?
Well, look, the fact that police officers are breaking into the wrong homes, and we've seen across the country that can lead to deadly consequences, is totally unacceptable. And that's something that the superintendent has to own and take responsibility for. Our expectation is when officers go to a judge, get a search warrant, they are basing it on good information. And if that information is faulty, or they make a mistake in the execution of that search warrant and go to the wrong house, that is a problem, and there has to be accountability. That's also an issue of supervision. And all up the chain, we can't continue to have that happen. It's not good enough to say we're sorry when people are. I saw something today where officers broke in on a kid's birthday party. That kid is forever going to be traumatized by that experience. So we have to do better. We have to make sure that we learn from the lessons, and that supervisors and the line officers are held accountable in a way that they seemingly haven't been.
Ms. Preckwinkle, you have 30 seconds for a response, a rebuttal.
You know, I think it's really important that our police department acknowledge its mistakes. And, you know, that has to do with the code of silence, which plagues our police department, and the racism within the police department. And we need to be sure that we have a leader of the police department that acknowledges both the code of silence and racism. We have to have a police department that acknowledges mistakes if we're going to have confidence in any human enterprise. Mistakes are going to be made. You have to acknowledge them and address them. And you cannot address them unless you acknowledge them. And in many of our black and brown communities, there's a feeling that the police are occupying force and not protecting them.
Okay. I have the next question directed to you, Ms. Preckwinkle. You want to keep aldermanic prerogative, and you have said that you will not reform City Council because it will organize or cleanse itself. But That's not working so far. Just days ago, Alderman Willie Cochran pleaded guilty to corruption. Alderman Ed Burke is charged in a federal indictment, and Alderman Danny Solis is under federal investigation. That's just the past couple of months, not to mention the dozens over the years. So how will your decision to keep the status quo in the council help end the corruption that plagues it?
No, I haven't talked about keeping the status quo. The first thing I always talk about is that it's important that the mayor have a vision for leading the city forward, and that mayor secure support in the council. You have to have a vision, but you also have to work collaboratively with the city council to make that vision work. It takes 26 votes to pass measures, and I think that's important to remember. You don't govern by fiat. You govern in collaboration with the legislative body. So the first thing that you have to have is a vision for how you want the city to move forward. And the second thing you need is, as I said, collaboration and cooperation with the members of the body. And I've done that in the work that I did in the city council to pass ordinances relating to affordable housing and living wages, fighting for working families. I got the support of my colleagues to move those initiatives forward. And I think there's some things that clearly we don't need to have aldermanic approval of. Letters, for example, to support affordable housing developments in your ward.
Thank you, Ms. Preckwinkle. Just a follow-up here. You talk about collaboration. What about oversight? Because we're seeing these cases of corruption. So what, if it's not an outside body, what can really be done to stop that?
Well, there is an outside body, the Inspector General, and the Inspector General should be able to look at aldermen as well as other city employees. But I think it's critical that you understand that there has to be a working relationship between the mayor and the members of the body, and it doesn't help for the mayor to demean and denigrate the work that so many of our aldermen do on behalf of their constituents.
Ms. Lightfoot, your rebuttal.
We can't keep having the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI be the oversight and the cleansing mechanism for our city council. I have a vision too, but I have a vision that I want to turn into reality. That vision includes ending aldermanic prerogative because it's corrosive and corrupting. The vision also in reality has to be term limits for chairmanships of city council committees. The city council is not reforming itself, and it will not do that without strong leadership from the mayor. And people all over the city recognize that we desperately need change, and it has to start with our government.
Thank you, Ms. Lightfoot. The next question comes from Kim.
Thank you. This has to do with the future of Chicago's neighborhoods. Right now, there are plans to spend $6 billion of our dollars to revitalize Lincoln Yards on the north side. Yet Michael Reese Hospital on the south side has sat vacant for 10 years with no real plan. Both of you have promised to break free from the Emmanuel downtown-centric plan and build up the neglected west and south sides. But the Department of Planning has always presented a detailed plan for the north side, where wealthy whites live, yet no plan for the south or west sides. What will development plans look like from your planning department? How will you change and utilize the planning department? And that's for you, Ms.
Well, first of all, we have to have a leader of the planning department that's going to execute a vision of economic development that is comprehensive and, of course, includes our neighborhoods. The City of Chicago hasn't had a land use plan since 1966. And what that means is where development happens and how it happens is completely left up to the vagaries of developers. So what we see is very little development south of Roosevelt Road and next to none west of Ashland. The city has to go into the neighborhoods. A lot of these neighborhoods have quality of life plans. There are assets and there are opportunities there, but we need to put together a comprehensive plan that's based upon consultation with stakeholders in these neighborhoods and lead that plan and not be led by developers who want to invest in the wealthy areas but leave our neighborhoods starving. That's got to be a cornerstone of economic development, and we can get into more details, but that's the framework that we have to use to have effectively a Marshall Plan to uplift the quality of life of our neighborhoods led by the city.
Thank you, Ms. Lightfoot. Ms. Preckwinkle, your rebuttal.
You know, I have always said that we need to focus on growth and opportunity, but the growth can't be focused only on downtown. It has to be focused on our neighborhoods as well. And unfortunately, throughout our history, we've put a lot of time and energy and money into focusing on downtown rather than our neighborhoods. We have to make the neighborhoods the focus. And frankly, that's the work that I've done as alderman of the 4th Ward. Worked hard with community residents to improve our neighborhood public schools, bring investment into our community, affordable rental housing, and economic development, shopping centers and supporting our small and medium-sized businesses and addressing the public safety challenges that our neighborhoods face. If we don't focus on our neighborhoods, we can't have a world-class city. We can only have a world-class city if we have strong neighborhoods, good neighborhood public schools, affordable housing in all of our communities, and we address the public safety challenges that our neighborhoods face. And that effort has to be led by the mayor and its experience that I've had that I'll bring into the mayor's office.
Thank you, Ms. Preckwinkle. Derek, the next question to Ms. Preckwinkle.
So the question for Ms. Preckwinkle is this. Excuse me. You put Ed Burke Jr. into a six-figure county job at his father's request, and you held a fundraiser at Burke's home and raised $100,000, actually over $100,000. I want to know, if you had it to do over, would you still have taken those actions?
Let me just say, I think the critical issue here is the work that I've done in the county to improve hiring practices and the way in which we deal with the challenges we face. Let me just say, when I came into office, there was a real issue around hiring. We had a lawsuit, and that lawsuit had gone on for 40 years. And I have done more than anybody in the last 40 years to meet the challenges of patronage hiring in the county. We worked with the plaintiffs and we worked with the court, and we presented a plan that included job descriptions and hiring plans, and we made the changes that we needed to make to ensure that we got out of that suit. And now everyone who's hired in the county, everyone who's hired not only has to meet the qualifications, but they're approved by the Inspector General and also by our Department of Human Resources. And as I said, when we got out of that lawsuit, both the judge and the plaintiffs praised us for our good work.
Thank you, Ms. Preckwinkle. Derek, you have a follow-up for her.
The hiring of Ed Burke Jr. appears to be a picture-perfect case of clout. That's the way people, ordinary citizens, see it, because their father could not go to you and secure a six-figure job for their kid. Was this or was this not a clout hire?
You know, he'd worked for the county for 20 years. His resume was sent to the Department of Homeland Security. He was vetted and hired for a very similar position to the one that he held in the sheriff's office.
So a clout hire, yes or no?
He worked for the county for 20 years, and his resume was sent to the Department of Homeland Security, and he basically transferred from the sheriff's office to the Department of Homeland Security. I mean, I think the real issues that people want to talk about as I go around the city are not these. They're about their own neighborhoods. People are focused on their communities. Some of them are challenged by gentrification. Some of them are challenged by lack of investment. But as I go around the city, the concerns that people raise with me are, what's going to happen to my neighborhood? Are we going to get the investment we need in housing and economic development? Are we going to be able to deal with the challenge that we face being forced out of our community by gentrification? Those are the issues that are raised by people as I go around the city.
Ms. Lightfoot, your response.
Of course it was a clout hire. And you may have made a mistake, but you just say it's a mistake. But if you can't acknowledge that, because you have aspired to climb the ladder of the broken and corrupt machine, that's a problem. And that's exactly what people see. And fundamentally, that is what's motivating people to say, we have to have change. We have to have a break from this kind of past. You're not going to see me aspiring to curry favor with the likes of an Ed Burke or Joe Barrios or Tony Resco. That's wrong, because they are part of the problem in our city, not just our politics, but in our government, and they're undermining the integrity of people's confidence in our ability to actually speak for them as opposed to the clouded few.
Just a quick yes or no to the both of you. If you are elected mayor, can we expect the decision would be made similarly to what was made here with Ed Burke Jr.? If someone comes to you with a resume and you're holding the office of mayor, would that be passed along to any other department to be considered?
You know, as county board president, I have about 1,000 meetings a year, and people come to me all the time with resumes and suggestions of people I might hire, and I forward them on to our Department of Human Resources, and they take the appropriate action.
Ms. Lightfoot?
I would tell somebody who asked me that to go directly to the department and follow the hiring protocol. When the mayor or the leader of the governmental entity passes something on, whether spoken or not, it suggests that this person needs to be hired. And you've got to be very careful about allowing yourself, intended or not, to be giving that unspoken cues to people. So the proper process is to say, here's what you need to be doing, here's the person.
We turn to Brad now for the next question.
All right, this is a question for both of you. People also want to talk about taxes. And who can forget the much maligned pop tax? The 1 penny an ounce tax was regressive. Regressive like many of Cook County's and the city's taxes and fees. Regressive meaning it affects poor people more. 20 cents for a 20-ounce pop is a much steeper hit for a poor person than the same 20 cents is for a rich person. Ms. Preckwinkle, it was your pop tax. Do you promise, if elected mayor, in the pursuit of revenue, you will not propose, support, or pass another regressive tax or fee or other in order to raise revenue? Yes or no?
Of course I won't. Here's the thing. It's important to understand.
Well, so you will not?
That's correct.
You will not? No more pop tax, no more regressive fees?
No.
Okay, then following that, how do you plan to raise revenue?
I think it's really important that we look at this through an equity lens, and that's why I always begin by talking about the need for a progressive income tax at the state level. Not only to stabilize the state's finances, but also to equitably raise revenues for cities, towns, and villages, which are disproportionately dependent on property taxes. So the first thing we need to do is to have, at the state level, a graduated income tax. And then I talk about, at the city level, ways of raising revenue. And TIFs are a perfect example. We have TIFs in some of the most valuable real estate in the city. We need to unwind those TIFs, and we need to declare TIF surpluses for additional sources of revenue. We need to do things like do better on workman's comp. We have $20 million spent on workman's comp in the county for 22,000 employees, and 5 times as much for 35,000 employees in the city.
Thank you, Ms. Preckwinkle. We have the next question, the same question from Brad to Ms. Lightfoot.
The soda tax is easy. No, it was a disaster. People are still talking about it, and people are still angry. Unfortunately, we also have a whole regime of regressive fines and fees, particularly around parking tickets and red light cameras. So unwinding all of those is not going to be easy. One, we've got to focus on that, and I'm determined to make sure that we're not continuing to balance the budget on the backs of people who are least able to handle it. But we also then have to think about ways in which we have revenue that is fair, that is progressive. But what I've also said is we have to make the case for new revenue. We are squandering precious tax dollars every single year to the tune of hundreds of millions. So before we go back to people and say, hey, we need more, we've got to demonstrate to them that we're going to be better fiscal stewards of their hard-earned tax dollars.
Thank you, Ms. Lightfoot. This next question is to you as well. Gentrification in many parts of Chicago is driving voters to call for rent control. And Ms. Lightfoot, you have declined to respond in a survey asking about how you feel about rent control. And later you said it is not the issue to focus on. But many voters disagree. In fact, in 3 recent elections, voters in many precincts overwhelmingly voted for rent control. And we know you've talked about building more affordable housing, so we're setting that aside. We want to focus on rent control here. Why are you against it?
I think that's not the answer. We don't need to wait for Springfield when we've got a housing crisis of 120,000 units down. We need to make sure that we're focusing on building those units. And I've offered up a very detailed housing plan that talks about using the new Department of Housing to actually get to yes with community-based developers as well as commercial developers. We also need to make sure that we get rid of automatic prerogative, which is a real impediment to building affordable housing. We need to make sure that we are holding developers accountable to build more on-site affordable housing units. And we need to do a better job clearly in the Department of Planning with those in lieu of fees, which have now apparently been dissipated into the general operating budget because they didn't organize a dedicated account for those. So I don't think we can wait for Springfield, and I don't know that rent control is going to solve this huge problem that's driving people out of the city, particularly families who don't feel like they can afford to live here.
Thank you, Ms. Lightfoot. Ms. Preckwinkle, your response.
I have pledged that I would support Representative Will Gazzari's efforts in Springfield to lift the ban on even talking about rent control. In many of our neighborhoods, residents are concerned about gentrification and the fact that they no longer can afford to rent or live in communities that they may have been the home of their family for generations. So that's a real challenge. I've been talking to people in the affordable housing development community. They're concerned about rent control, but they also understand that we have to build thousands of units of affordable housing if we're going to meet the demand. And that's what I did when I was alderman of the 4th Ward. We built 1,500 units of housing, most of it affordable rental housing. And it was a result of aldermanic initiative, frankly, and working closely with community residents, developers, and the CHA. It's possible to do this in our communities. It takes hard work, and it takes initiative, and it takes cooperation and collaboration between community and business. But I think it's also important to look at things like leveraging development downtown, not just through the Affordable Requirements Ordinance and in lieu payments, but bringing the developers to the table as you can if you're mayor, and demanding that they help us rebuild our neighborhoods as well as profiting from downtown development.
Kim, you have the next question.
Do I get a
rebuttal if you would like? Yes.
Yeah. So we've talked about one part of the affordable housing problem, but really the epicenter of it is the broken and corrupt property tax system presided over by Joe Barrios. We have to fix that system because it has a horrible ripple effect on homeowners, on renters, on landlords. Because commercial properties downtown are undervalued, that assessment has to be made up somewhere. And right now, it's being made up on the backs of low-income and working-class homeowners.
Ms. Preckwinkle, you have the same opportunity if you would like to take it for a rebuttal.
Sure. You know, when the Tribune story came out, I brought the assessor in and said, we've got to figure out if this is really true. We brought in a national expert. They confirmed it. I worked with Assessor Barrios to try to reform our property tax system. And I've worked with Assessor Kagi to do the same. And the challenge really is the broken property tax system. And that's why I focus so strongly on raising revenue equitably. And the graduated income tax, the fair tax that Governor Pritzker and others have been talking about for some time. We have to raise revenue more equitably, and the property tax that our local units of government rely on is not an equitable way to do it.
Thank you. Now we turn back to Kim for the question.
This is a question for both of you. You will both be able to answer and respond. Ms. Preckwinkle, CPS is under a government monitor due to discrimination in its execution of a special education program, as well as a notorious sex and physical abuse scandal that was only addressed when it made the front page of the Chicago Tribune. You are on record as stating that you are going to retain the current administration, even with all of that. But to all of the parents who have suffered under this administration, please explain why.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand that we need some stability in the CPS leadership. We've had 4 different leaders in the last 8 years, and that's a challenge for any institution or organization. But what I've said is that there are a number of things that I think need to be done. We need an elected school board so that parents and community residents can have real input into their schools. We need a moratorium on school closings and a moratorium on new charter schools. And I think that kind of reform context has to be bought in by the existing superintendent. These particular challenges, special education and the predatory behavior of some adults toward our young people, are just unconscionable. We have to be sure that our young people are safe in the schools. That's the first priority. Schools are safe havens in their neighborhoods, and we want to be sure that all of our young people feel safe and secure in those communities, and they get the kind of support they need. You know, it's really critical that our neighborhood schools are well resourced. In our public school district, we have the fewest adults per child of any district in the state.
Thank you, Kim.
Ms. Preckwinkle just mentioned that there needs to be consistency, but consistency of bad policy is that good, considering the current administration tried to close NTA, which was an 80% black, 80% low-income school, and only the court stopped that, as well as attempted to close all of the high schools in Inglewood, which would not happen in any other community. So what do you do as far as this administration?
I've said repeatedly, I've stood with the parents of NTA. I do not understand why that action was taken. It makes no sense. Those kids, those parents, those teachers did everything that we ask of them, which is to turn a failing school around to a level 1+ school. And the fact that the administration and Rahm Emanuel tried to close that school and turn it into a high school for the South Loop, to me, is unconscionable. What I've said is Janice Jackson needs to go to that school and make it right with those parents. She needs to apologize. And they are supportive of my campaign. I check in with them time to time. She still hasn't done that. And you mentioned the sex abuse scandal. It's an epic failure of leadership by Rahm Emanuel and Janice Jackson. That's why I have concerns. I agree. We've had 5 CEOs in the last 7 years. And despite that, we've made gains in the system. But that kind of epic leadership fail has to have accountability. That's why I'm willing to hear her out, but she's got to demonstrate to me that she understands that she made a mistake and rectify that with the parents and the teachers and the kids.
Thank you, Ms. Lightfoot. Kim, do you have a follow-up?
Well, she kind of answered it. Are you sticking with the current administration of CPS?
For now. But I think we have a lot of serious questions. I have a lot of serious questions that I need to ask her and her leadership team to make sure that they're never going to make these kind of mistakes again. I mean, the sex abuse scandal was outrageous. They got notice in January. They did nothing until June 5th, after the Tribune story broke, and then stumbled and fumbled for weeks. It's unacceptable, and that's got to change. I didn't think we'd have to talk about the fact that our kids have to be in a safe environment. Of course, it should be nurturing, but safety clearly is something that parents expect, and we should be delivering, and it's unacceptable what happened.
I think it's really important to go on to this point about safety in our schools. Our schools are safe havens in many neighborhoods, and it's really critical that young people feel safe and secure in those communities. And one of the challenges we have is we're not investing in enough adults in our schools. We have more than 800 school districts in the state of Illinois, and our school district has the lowest percentage of adults in relation to children in the school. We have about half the number of adults that most school districts have in their schools. So this is a real challenge. We need more adults to provide leadership and nurturing and support. And I think we can make our schools safer and make them better learning environments if we have more adults. We need nurses, we need social workers, we need librarians, and in many of our schools, we don't have those resources to provide the kids with a real opportunity to succeed in school. And that's the real challenge. We've got to have more caring adults, professionals in our schools if we want our young people to succeed.
Thank you, Ms. Preckwinkle. Derek, the next question comes from you.
And the next question goes to Ms. Preckwinkle. A new contract for the Fraternal Order of Police will be one of the first challenges you face if elected. Officers currently enjoy unique protections if and when they engage in misconduct. Just one example, officers are able to view video evidence, for example, dash cam or body cam video, before giving statements on what happened. That gives the officer extra time to formulate their defense. What specific changes will you demand in the contract upcoming?
Well, you know, I've talked about this repeatedly, and I've said I don't think it makes sense to negotiate with your unions in front of a television audience before you've even sat down at the bargaining table with them. But I think there's some clear issues that we have to address. One is leadership and culture in the police department. You know, the police superintendent has to acknowledge that there's a code of silence in the police department that hampers our ability to hold officers accountable for their bad acts and encourages, frankly, other officers to cover up for them. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is racism in our police department. You know, all of our institutions in this country, in this society, struggle with this, but it's a particular challenge in our police department because it impacts how police officers interact with people in our neighborhoods, particularly in black and brown neighborhoods, where in many of our communities, the police are viewed as an occupying force and not as folks who serve and protect them. And I think those are really critical issues. And so I would start with the leadership of the police department, acknowledging the challenges we face and working to address them in the culture of the police department.
Thank you, Ms. Preckwinkle. Ms. Lightfoot, your response.
Were you going to ask a follow-up?
Well, my question was, there were specific recommendations handed down from the Police Accountability Task Force and also in the Justice Department report. Why can you not give any specifics on things that might be able to be changed in the contract when these have been publicly discussed?
Well, here, I think, as I said, I think it's a mistake to negotiate your contract in public rather than with your workers first. And that's a principle not just for the Fraternal Order of Police, but for all of our contract negotiations. And then, frankly, it raises sometimes unrealistic expectations of what actually will transpire. And so I think it's really important that you keep your negotiating strategy closely held and that you work with your unions and come up with a mutual agreement. And it has to be one that, frankly, that respects both our officers, most of whom are good and decent people who struggle every day to do a difficult job well, and the needs of our public for a police force that they can have confidence in, that will serve and protect them. And we have real challenges now in confidence in our police officers around accountability for dealing with our most violent crimes. We talked about murder and shootings. 15% closure rate for murders and less than 10% for shootings. It doesn't give people confidence that the police take seriously the crimes in black and brown neighborhoods where so much of the violence takes place.
Okay, now, Ms. Lightfoot, your response or rebuttal.
You know, as Derek, as you indicated, there's no secrets here about what needs to change. It was laid out 3 years ago in the Police Accountability Task Force, again in January of 2017 by the DOJ, and there's been a group of community-based organizations that are picking up those roadmaps to talk about it. Some of the things that are critically important: we can't allow disciplinary records to be destroyed. We have to allow for anonymous complaints. We can't force stop investigations if a complainant hasn't filed an affidavit, and we have to be able to use past disciplinary records to determine whether there's a pattern of conduct on the part of an officer. These are straightforward things that have to be part of those.
Your time, Ms. Lightfoot. Now we turn back to Brad for the next question.
And piggybacking off of Mr. Blakely's question, this is a question for both of you. CBS 2 investigators exposed white CPD officer James A. Hunt. He went viral, caught on phone camera telling a young black man, quote, "I kill MFs." That's a sterilized version. Officer Hunt continually harassed the young black man on the day in question in 2018, eventually arresting him. The charges were tossed. He arrested him again on another occasion. The charges were tossed. Again, the officer proclaimed he killed MFs. And come to find out, Officer Hunt did shoot and kill a young black man, shot him 10 times in 2014. His name was Deshaun Pittman. It took 8 months for COPA to complete its investigation into Hunt's I kill MFs incident. To this day, today, Hunt is still on full-duty patrol. He ranks in the top 95th percentile and the top 99th percentile of officers when it comes to complaints and use of force. Ms. Lightfoot, as mayor, what would you do with Officer Hunt?
I have serious questions for the superintendent why that officer wasn't stripped of his police powers and put in callback, and that disciplinary action charges should have been filed against him in front of the police board. That's what should happen. Yeah.
Ms. Preckwinkle, what would you do with Officer Hunt?
I concur. This is action that has to be taken by a police superintendent. And let me just say, this is really troubling, and this is not an isolated incident. I wish it were. Jason Van Dyke was found guilty of murdering Laquan McDonald. This is the first officer in 50 years that was found guilty of murdering one of our residents. But we all know that he's not the first officer who was guilty of murdering one of our residents. So there's a real challenge in terms of accountability in our police department. This Officer Hunt is not the only bad actor who's gotten away with murder. You know, I think it's important to remember, too, that Jason Van Dyke, although he was convicted, got 81 months. 81 months. In the same year, in the same week, not year, in the same week that the murderer of Hydea Pendleton got an 84-year sentence for her murder. So we have a white patrol officer who killed a black young man and a young black man who killed a black woman, and very different, very disparate sentences in the criminal justice system. And that's a challenge for all of us in terms of our faith in the justice in our justice system.
Time is up, Ms. Preckwinkle.
Just to be clear, Officer Hunt, who did shoot Deshaun Pittman 10 times, some of them in the back in 2014, was cleared. It was deemed reasonable by IPRA, preceder of COPA.
Thank you. Now we turn to Kim for a question to Ms. Lightfoot.
Ms. Lightfoot, this is a question about procurement.
Sure.
Blacks make up approximately 30% of the city's population and only get 8% of the city's contracts. Yet we discuss how economic development must come to the Black community, but the city will not even give African Americans contracts. You worked in procurement under Mayor Daley. The numbers were dismal then as well. Will your administration finally be the one to commit to award city contracts to the Black community that actually reflect the percentage of Black people in this city?
Well, I worked in the procurement department for 8 months to go in and specifically to clean up the corrupt minority and women-owned business enterprise system. So of course, I've said repeatedly, the city can immediately today do several things. Number one, the city procures approximately $2 billion every year in goods and services. They can break down those contracts into small enough pieces that black and minority and women and veterans-owned businesses can get those contracts on their own without having to go say, "Mother, may I," to a larger prime. And of course, once we give those contracts, we need to pay them in a timely fashion, 60 or 90 or 120 days, which is typical, unfortunately, for the procurement department, breaks the backs of small businesses. The other thing that the city can do immediately today is start asking some of these bigger companies the question around supplier diversity, which effectively means, what are you doing in your other contracting work to make sure that you're providing opportunities for women, minority, and veterans-owned businesses? The other thing that the city should be doing is using the bully pulpit of the mayor's office to give access to capital to these same kinds of businesses, because that's one of the biggest impediments for businesses to be able to grow and thrive. I also think that we ought to create incubator spaces in our neighborhoods and use professional services like lawyers,
Ms. Lightfoot, your time.
Fine.
Ms. Preckwinkle, your rebuttal.
I'm sorry, before we get to Preckwinkle, really quickly, because the conversation went back to minority. And I was very clear with the terminology that I used. The economic instability of Black communities, which everyone has unanimously decided is leading to all of the crime. Blacks receive 8% of city contracts. We are approximately 30% of the population. Will you commit to a specific focus on bringing up the contracts to the Black community to match the percentage of Blacks in Chicago?
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Okay, now Ms. Preckwinkle, your response.
Sure. You know, I think it's really important that government lead the way in terms of providing opportunities for minority business enterprises and women business enterprises. And we've done that in the county. The first thing we did was invest in technology so we could really track our contracting and know where we were on a day-to-day basis on our contracts, because we found ourselves at the beginning with a situation where we could only determine whether or not MBE and WBE percentages were met at the end and then fine people. So we wanted to be sure that we invested in technology so we could have the information right at hand and take corrective action as in the course of contracts rather than waiting until the end. You know, and I really think it's important that we not only look at the opportunities for the city, but, you know, all of our sister agencies, so the Park District and the CHA and the city colleges. We have to look at opportunities there as well. It can't just be focused on the city alone. And secondly, we've got to invest in our businesses in our neighborhoods on the south and west sides of our city. And we can do that through grant and loan programs in partnership with the private sector and using our own resources. We have to invest in these neighborhood businesses if we want to have strong communities.
We're going to switch gears here. We have asked you questions, the panelists and I. Now we want you to ask each other a question. You will have 15 seconds for the question and 30 seconds for the answer. Ms. Lightfoot, you may begin.
My question to President
Your question to Ms. Preckwinkle.
Madam President, what I'd ask is, what do you say to young people about what you would do in your 4 years as mayor, if you're lucky enough to win next week, to build hope for them so that they can stay and thrive in this city?
You know, we have a wonderful city, and we need to ensure that all of our young people have opportunity in that city. And I have focused very strongly on public education because I know that education is an escalator. And we really need to be sure that all of our neighborhood schools are well-resourced and provide people with that education escalator. And not only our neighborhood elementary schools, but our high schools, that they provide opportunities not only for college preparation, but for vocational training, for STEM programming, and for opportunities beyond college.
Now, your turn to ask the question.
Sure. You know, you are a corporate lawyer, and it's something that you've said that you are proud of. However, you have defended corporations accused of age and race discrimination, and you were a supporter of, you were an attorney for the Republicans who challenged the Democratic map. What do you regret most in your professional life?
Well, there she goes again. Here's what I'm going to answer this question and say. You've made a hallmark of your campaign since February 26 to denigrate me, to challenge me, to portray me as something other than I am. Our children are watching. You talk about your grandchildren all the time. And I have to explain to my daughter what it means when adults lie. I have to explain to my daughter what it means when adults are bullies. And I have to explain to my daughter what it means when an adult says something that's not true just to try to score political points. Our children are watching, and I think it's critically important that we conduct ourselves in a way that they can be proud and we can be proud of them.
Ms. Preckwinkle, do you have a response to that?
Sure. You know, I think it's really important in political campaigns that not only you share your own views and vision, but you contrast your position to your opponent. And, you know, this is a person who is complaining now about the tenor of the campaign, but who in the first debate called me a liar and has repeatedly said that you know, I'm a cockroach. So, you know, I think it's a little bit hypocritical for her to complain now about the tenor of the campaign. I'm a person who spent my entire life in public service as a teacher working for not-for-profits, as an elected official. I'm proud of that work, and I think that that work well prepares me to be mayor of the city of Chicago.
All right. Now we want the two of you to state your case. 6 days until Election Day, you each have a minute for closing remarks. First, to Ms. Lightfoot.
Well, as I said, I think this election is historic because it presents us with the opportunity to break from the corrupt political machine. It gives us an opportunity to speak our values in a different and more profound way and to talk about hope and optimism and building the kind of city that our children can actually live in. I think that we need to make sure that we have a city where public safety is not just a commodity for the rich, but is really available in every neighborhood. We have to have a city where we have true affordable housing options so our young people can stay, so our older citizens can also live in dignity. We need to make sure that we are tackling the challenges of our city finances. But we can't do any of that if we don't have a leader who stands for integrity, who stands for bringing people together and not the divisive politics of the past. I believe that I am such a leader, and I hope that on April 2nd, I'll be able to come back to all of you and say thank you for making me your next mayor.
Ms. Preckwinkle, you get the last word.
Thank you very much for inviting us this evening. I really appreciate this opportunity to share my vision for Chicago. As I said in my opening remarks, I'm a fighter. I spent my childhood fighting my way home from school, and I've spent my adult life fighting for working people and working families. That's why I support a $15 an hour minimum wage, to be sure that people in our city are able to support themselves and their families. That's why I support loans and grants to our businesses so that they can create jobs in our neighborhoods. I've done the difficult work of community building, improving our public schools, bringing housing to our neighborhoods, particularly affordable rental housing, and also trying to make our streets safer. This is work that I've done in collaboration with community residents. And that collaborative spirit is what I'll bring into the mayor's office. And that's different from what's happened in the city for the last several decades. Somebody focus on neighborhood development and bringing the concerns of neighborhood people into that office is really critical if we're going to have the city that we all love.
Thank you. Thank you to you both, Ms. Lightfoot and Ms. Preckwinkle. There's a lot at stake as voters consider your positions on the issues in these final days. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
Why is Tony Preckwinkle launching an incorrect, full-blown attack against Lori Lightfoot?
Getting tangled up in the corruption charge against Alderman Burke.
Tony Preckwinkle is doing everything she can to distance herself from Ed Burke.
There's a scandal in Tony Preckwinkle's office.
Preckwinkle hired Burke's son for a county job.
Tony Preckwinkle deals with the growing backlash over Cook County's tax on sugary drinks.
An entrenched political insider won't lead Chicago forward. It's time to bring in the light.
Mayor Pawar is a typical politician. Pawar's missed more than half his meetings as alderman, one of the worst records in the city council. And when he did show up, Pawar voted for the largest property tax hike in Chicago history. But Melissa Conyers-Irvin shows up for us every day. As State Rep, Melissa protected child care for Chicago families. Her plan will make the Treasurer's office more independent from politicians and ensure we invest in every neighborhood, not just downtown.
She's ready for this.
Oh, you bet I am.
Melissa Conyers-Irvin for Treasurer.
Legacy and the Business Leadership Council. Joining me right now is Delmarie Cobb with Ida's Legacy, and I'm just curious, overall, what did you think of the debate that, and what you just heard?
Well, this was an opportunity once again to see what the contrast is between their visions. And they both had an opportunity to lay out their visions for us. And this is a very critical time for the city of Chicago. We know that in many cases, the neighborhoods are holding on by their fingernails. And so who gets in that office and how they see the South Side and West Side in terms of development for the entire community or the city is very important. And that's what everybody is waiting to see and hear from these two candidates. Because what we've seen is a downtown-centered development strategy that has left the West Side and the South Side really wanting and hanging on by sheer thread.
And that was definitely touched upon tonight, too, which I know was appreciated. Felicia Rawls, you are with the Business Leadership Council. Thank you again as well. Any one issue stand out to you that was discussed tonight that you thought was especially important to have been brought up?
Yes, absolutely. I think it was great that both candidates discussed the revitalization on the south and west sides of Chicago, specifically granting grants and loans to neighborhood businesses. I think ultimately that's going to give individuals in those neighborhoods jobs and also provide business opportunities that will ultimately lead to thriving neighborhoods.
And you think that was adequately addressed?
Yes.
Evening. How important is it to, I think a lot of the issues and the questions tonight were focused on issues that were, I believe, important to the African American community. Is there any one issue that you would like even more information on moving forward that voters might want more information about?
Well, I think we have to come up with a real plan for stimulating growth on the South and West Side. We see the African American community moving out of the city of Chicago. And this was once the land of opportunity. African Americans came here for that. Now they're leaving because of the lack of opportunity. So we've got to talk about how to really stimulate growth in the South and West Sides of the city of Chicago.
Okay, and Felicia, I'll leave this. Motivate voters. What would you say to voters right now about getting out and casting that all-important vote next week?
I would say everyone has a voice. You need to make sure that the candidates understand that you have that voice. Go to the polls. That is the way that we're all going to know that you're out there and that your issues matter.
And get out and vote. That's very important. Felicia Rawls, Business Leadership Council, Delmarie Cobb, Ida's Legacy. Thank you both so much for being part of this. Erica?
Thank you, Dana. And with that, we conclude the final televised mayoral debate with Lori Lightfoot and Tony Preckwinkle. I'm Erica Sargent. For our panelists, Brad Edwards, Kim Agowan, Derek Blakely, as well as our partners, the Business Leadership Council and Ida B. Wells Legacy Committee and Morningstar, have a great night.